I want to just thank everyone for having me here, and I'm excited to be presenting on this topic. I work in student engagement and retention, which is a division in student services. There. One thing I wanted to mention before I get going is my personal invitation to you to try and be comfortable in this space. And if that means you are more comfortable standing, or you need to squirm around in your seat a little bit, or you need to rotate your chair, I just invite you to do that, or to take care of your needs as best as you can today and this morning. My very teeny tiny 6 slides will be available, and wanted to give you some context in my current role within student engagement. So I have this very interesting title called Student Development Educator, which I find continually quite odd. But essentially what I do is I work with student programming and staff members to try and think about their programming from a holistic perspective. And while doing that, I've come to, in my own practice, embed elements of well-being through that whole process. So I guess why this topic, and this is something I've thought about for the last maybe 7 or 8 years while working with student groups, and I've worked with student groups of small size, 4 to 6 students, staff and volunteers, up to enormous sizes where I was working with 150 student leaders and then additional student volunteers from high school levels. There is significant pressure for students to be extremely involved. And what I mean by that is they're hoping to leave university not just with their robust and rigorous in-classroom experience, but also with out-of-classroom experience, with references, with transferable skills that they need to take to different places. This is a photo of a few of me in my current student leader team within peer education. But what I've noticed is that there is such a thing as being too involved. And I think that's kind of a funny concept because we think of co-curricular things as fun. Orientation, it's fun. Working in rec and athletics, fun. It is those things and can also be extremely stressful. I've noticed having students working, upwards of 20, 25 hours a week outside of the classroom on top of a full course load. It can really be a lot. So wanted to think a little bit today about subtle strategies as well as overt strategies for embedding well-being within co-curricular environments. Okay, so I like to think of this as starting from the beginning for when you're first thinking about and designing a student leader position. I try to embed elements of well-being right within the job description. And the way I do that is just to make it clear and succinct. And as part of my role, I also I work very closely with peer education and now the Student Academic Advisor Program. But part of my role is also a bit of a consulting relationship with any random person around the university who might have a question about they want to start a student volunteer program, they want to start a student staff role, and they'd like some input. So often this is sort of the path of the conversations that I'm having. And what I encourage my colleagues to do and what I try to do myself as well is, where possible, explicit job descriptions. And I know that sounds really quite straightforward and basic. There's a number of, I would say, students who've been hired into a volunteer or a paid position as a student leader, and they don't actually know what their role is. They don't know who their supervisor is. They don't know where to go for assistance or for help. And so trying to just set those clear expectations right from the beginning is something I try to do. The next element comes down to both screening and selection. So when I am recruiting for student volunteers, and I'll use the term student leaders to try and encompass both paid and unpaid student roles, but when I'm thinking about screening, I try to post the job description as early as possible. It's not your standard, it's not like HR when you're posting something for 2 weeks or 4 weeks or 1 week. When I have student positions available, I try to post them as long as possible so that more students can see them, and so that students can plan their time accordingly when they're trying to prepare their applications. I would say throughout all of these strategies, there's a theme of flexibility coupled with high standards. So I don't believe in giving students I don't want to set the bar low for them so as to alleviate their stress. I want to set the bar high, but make it explicit. And through the screening and selection process, what I also try and take note of is really trying to make sure students who, on paper, look like they may not be a great fit. Maybe they have no experience yet. Maybe they have some errors in their cover letter and resume. Maybe there's some gaps in their experience, what have you. I always try to interview them. This may be an opportunity for them to grow and develop, and they may have not had that opportunity yet, so I think that's something I try to embed within that process. When I'm considering which students to select, I really try to embody a fit-to-team approach, so trying to hire which students will work best together, which students will this both be an exceptional opportunity for, and bring their strengths to the role. I also encourage my colleagues, as well as something I try to do myself, is you don't always have to select the student who has been already involved in everything. And I think that is a really challenging item for staff members, because those students they tend to interview better. There's a few in this room. They tend to interview better. They tend to have a very full resume. They probably will step into the role and do exceptionally well. That said, it may be a good opportunity to give someone else a chance. So that's something I really try to think about when I'm selecting students. When it comes to training and learning outcomes, student engagement, we really try to adopt a blended learning model. So we do a lot of our training online as well as in person, and sort of back-to-back in those different environments. So we try to do that as a means of embedding flexibility for the students' learning experience. There's opportunity within both environments to interact with their fellow student leaders, both the new ones and sort of students who are experienced in those roles. And of course, there's ongoing development, conversations, and feedback. So where possible, unless it was in the case where I was supervising 150 students, I did not meet with them regularly. But what I do try to do with smaller teams of, say, like 20 or less, is meet with those students at least twice a semester. And within those conversations, I always open with, how are you doing in school? And that came from a very painful learning experience for me, because I didn't ask that before, and then had found out one of my students, this is when I used to work in recreation, and he had been working, and he all of a sudden wanted to pick up more hours. And I said, are you okay with, are you sure you can manage that? This is already 15 hours a week. You're doing other things, are you sure that's okay? And he goes, oh yeah, well I'm on academic probation, and I probably have to withdraw this semester, so I thought I'd add more hours anyways. And I was just like, I probably should have known that earlier. So it was one of those learning opportunities for me where I recognized that it's important to at least have that conversation with students about how are you doing and how are you balancing your academic coursework with all of your co-curricular involvement. So kind of moving on to some of the more subtle strategies that I try to embed. Again, I mentioned that clarity of expectation. I think it's a bit of an art, especially when I've been working with large groups of student volunteers. Sometimes there's a bit of downtime, and there's always this pressure to what can we give the students right now? What's something that they could be working on perhaps? And I think sometimes we get caught up in that, and we give students a body of work that's actually quite vague or quite unclear. And so trying to just be clear with your expectations, making sure that they understand that there's opportunity for questions, I've found to be very successful. Flexibility is something I try to embed throughout where possible. And by flexibility, I mean encouraging students to take a semester off for co-op if they want to, encouraging students to do a semester abroad or a semester in dialogue, just encouraging them to explore what can they take from their university experience that will really enrich that experience for them. And knowing that them as a student volunteer or a student staff member, they have an opportunity to come back to their role when they're done that other experience. Probably the biggest thing I find that I do with students in one-on-one conversations and in groups is myth busting. oh, I've done this many units. I should really be this much closer to my degree. I should really finish my degree in 4 years. I should really have figured out what I'm doing with my life already. I was like, I haven't figured out what I'm doing with my life. It's okay. It doesn't mean to stop exploring. It just means to kind of take a little bit of that pressure off of them. Within that myth busting, I think it's really critical to be referring students to relevant resources on campus. And so the number of students I've both perhaps walked with to career services or health and counseling services, if that was the resource they needed at that moment, is probably higher than other staff members. But I think it's really important as just being an opportunity to be that contact person for that student and making sure they're making those referrals and connecting to the resources that they need. I put email on here, which I think is kind of silly, but we as staff and I'm sure as faculty members, I'm sure you get tons of email, and students also get a ridiculous amount of email. And so what I've tried to do with emailing students is, where possible, I try to do one weekly email. And this works for me in a couple of ways. One, I can warn my students sometime on Thursday, and I try not to give them a time because usually it's sort of like later in the day if I don't get to it. Sometime on Thursdays, I will send you a big weekly update, as organized as possible as I can keep it, with some updates from this week and things you may need to know for the coming week, and to tell the students to look out for that weekly update, which has also held me accountable, because I do remember a few times where I missed that Thursday update, and I had a student pop by my office and say, "We missed the weekly update. Is everything okay? Am I off the email list?" I'm like, no, I'm just kind of behind, but thank you. So what I found with that is that it both makes me focus my messaging, but also I find students do read and kind of absorb that information a little bit better. And it's for me personally, it's a good exercise to have to distill my email messaging. Instead of sending 5 emails really quickly, I send one, a better one. And all of this for me kind of comes down to role modeling and trying to set boundaries within normal workday and model that for your students. Kind of going off of my email piece, I had a student once who had worked for me for almost 2 years in recreation, and she was exceptional. She was doing this, she was doing that. She also taught at she taught at a Taekwondo school. She was doing all kinds of stuff outside of the classroom. I found out that year she was actually working 35 hours outside of class on top of a full course load. So 12 units in the sciences. Incredible individual. And I said to her, we need to let's figure out how you can set better boundaries in terms of saying no to things, and I want you to be sleeping more and things like that, because she was up all night. And she goes, "But you sent an email at 2 a.m. last night." I was like, good point. So it was just a good reminder for me to kind of role model that behavior. So in summary, I hope that gives you some ideas for both kind of direct and subtle strategies. One of the subtle strategies I did right at the start of this talk was just encouraging you to stretch and move around a little bit. So encourage you to embed those where possible. My contact information is there, and encourage you to check out our website. It's very long, but it's students, smu.ca/students/get involved, which is the student engagement and retention website. So thank you very much for your attention today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.